Well, I'm so grateful that you joined me today for this conversation for our students. The students will have your bio, but I'd like you to explain a little bit about what you do for Jewish Family Services. But before you talk about Jewish Family Services, why don't you talk about what you did before that, because it has particular relevance to the University of Washington.
Sure. So immediately before, I actually helped start a national organization called Repair the World, which was really designed to make service a dominant value in the Jewish community. And prior to that, I actually was the Hillel director at the University of Washington just down the road, and I was there for about 7 years.
I called you Will. Would you prefer to be called Rabbi Will?
And it's to the point, like, I'm Will, but sometimes people need to call me Rabbi for their need, which is completely fine. But if I need you to call me Rabbi for me, then that's a problem. You know what I mean? Like, it's more about what does the person, so you can call me Will.
Say more about that. When somebody calls you Rabbi, why are they invoking Rabbi for you?
Yeah, so to me, my name is Will. I studied as a rabbi, I'm trained as a rabbi, but if it's about me being called Rabbi Berkovitz or Rabbi Will Berkovitz, and it's about my ego need, that's the wrong reason for it. If it's about somebody else has a need as an honorific, then I'm completely comfortable with that.
Talk about the work that you're doing now with Jewish Family Services.
Yeah, so Jewish Family Service, we've been around for about 130 some years. We were founded primarily really to resettle and work with the Jewish community who was fleeing Eastern Europe. And then after the Holocaust, that actually obviously expanded. Today, we're a multi-service agency. We're actually one of the fewer ones left, where we do everything from refugee resettlement. We work with unaccompanied minors. We work with children survivors of trafficking. We work with asylum seekers, and that's deeply rooted in the Jewish experience, which is why it's so core to who we do. And we're not actually resettling any Jewish refugees at this moment. We also work with survivors of domestic violence. We work with folks who are seniors and Holocaust survivors. We have a food bank and community stabilization services to help keep people housed. We work with folks with various forms of disabilities, and we do a lot of community education and outreach as well.
You are at the center point of a wide range of people in the community. Describe some of the tensions that you're holding that is natural to the work. What are some of the tensions that you're holding in the work relative to the community that you serve?
Yeah, I think it is, this has become increasingly an incredibly complicated time. Things that historically were not political topics have become extremely politicized. Virtually everything has become extremely politicized. I think what you see in the Jewish community specifically, and again, JFS serves well beyond the Jewish community, we serve the whole community. But what you see is the same tensions that exist in broader society exist in microcosm within the Jewish community. And I think to say the Jewish community is also a bit of a misnomer, right, because in reality there are many communities that make up the Jewish community. Right. And so those tensions and fault lines exist along pretty similar patterns that you might see in the broader community. Yeah.
Well, I do want to name the fact that we're having this conversation now. I've invited you to a campus. My work is with students during a particularly difficult time on college campuses. And since October 7th, I want to talk a little bit about October 7th because we're approaching a year from October 7th, which has become a thing unto itself, even naming just a date, and it has so much meaning. Campuses around the country have been disruptive places, and the interpretation of what's happening on these campuses has been varied. But as we sit here, I sent this invitation to you, and I was sending the questions to you yesterday, and as I was sending them to you, there was a disruption on campus. And many members of our Jewish community were very, very upset by an activist event. And I wasn't sure that you'd come and talk, because I wasn't sure if you felt like there was risk to coming to campus, risk to your reputation, risk to your safety. Why did you say yes to coming to campus at this moment, given that it's a tumultuous moment as we speak?
This is really interesting, and I've been thinking a lot about this. So when I was a college student, I remember having a debate with a friend of mine, and I know in today's parlance this is probably completely not going to fly. But the argument I was having was with somebody who she didn't want to shave her legs to get a job. And I said to her, I'm like, well, you can do that, and you'll stand by your ideology. But the question is you'll be doing that, but you'll be on the outside of the conversation. Would you rather be on the outside of the conversation, or do something like that might feel slightly less authentic than who you would like to be, but be sitting around the table? And to me, I made that same calculus. All through my life, I've had to make that calculus. And in some level, it's like, I don't think there's a value in not talking and silencing and turning people into caricatures. And I think the only way you don't turn people into caricatures is by engaging them in their humanity, and then trusting that the person across the table is doing the same thing from the same generosity of spirit.
During times of real fear and tumult, the easy thing to do is other. There's an us versus them. You have a philosophy about all of this, because it seems like you're constantly doing the work of bridging. So talk about that philosophy of yours.
Yeah, so I think of it as, and I think I may have even written this to you, I think of that in terms of, Martin Buber talks about having I-it relationships, where you look at things in transactional terms, or I-thou relationships. You know, there's a philosopher, Emmanuel Levinas, who says you have to see the face of the other, which is a very Jewish concept. And you have to actually be willing to do that. And where things really go terribly wrong historically is where we dehumanize and we don't see the face of the other, where we see people as its, which are things you can then, people that become objects in which you are in some form of transactional relationship with. And I just don't see that as, that's a pretty antithetical to how my education as a rabbi taught me. And it's also against my very core being.
What are some of the divisions that you're having to address now, and what are the bridges that you're having to both within the Jewish community and outside of the Jewish community? Because the extent of othering that's going on now in our midst is really pretty powerful. I don't want to say it's worse than ever in history, because we've had some times historically, but this moment is pretty unique. So what are some of the divisions that you're having to bridge?
Well, one, do we have somebody on their side of the table who's actually really interested in being an ally, being a partner, being in relationship, or again, are we just being used? I think one of the worst things that has happened, you brought up October 7th, one of the and actually I'd written something about this the previous year. There was a hostage situation in Texas, Colville, Texas. And what I was so shocked by was nobody reached out to me, and then I asked around to all of my colleagues. Nobody reached out to anybody to sort of just express sympathy, express concern. And we're talking close people that I've worked with and I've stood side by side with, and I was really struck by that. And so I wrote something which I think the Seattle Times covered, but then I also called them out on it specifically and said, hey, where were you? October 7th, I had assumed people would have kind of learned the lesson, but it was worse. Because what happened is not only did people not call, but the people who I personally have fought for and supported and really talk about threat and risk and social capital and reputational, I really put that out there, and not one of those people reached out. And that is, I think, the place where the Jewish community finds itself today. So to hold by the value structure and system that I was just articulating before, I had a conversation this morning, the same thing, where I cannot live by my greatest fears. I don't want my kids, I want them to seek the highest aspirations of what's possible and live by our hopes. That doesn't mean we're Pollyannish. It doesn't mean you put your head in the sand. You know, I'm very pragmatic, but I don't want to sacrifice my idealism. But I don't think you can be, I'm not an ideologue. I don't believe in that. I think I always say describe life as whitewater rafting, not synchronized swimming. And if you hold so tight to your ideology, you can do that.
Yeah.
But you're going to be disappointed over and over and over again, and it's not the way to live a life.
Yeah. Yeah.
But that's my view on it.
That's your view on it. Yeah. I want to read something that you've written, Will, that you sent to me within the last few weeks. You said, as we approach the start of a new school year, with colleges and universities welcoming both new and returning students, there's an undercurrent of uncertainty. Will there be more protests, more divisions, more seemingly intractable issues, which we all, whether on campuses or not, are having difficulty discussing with civility and compassion? You raise these questions. Say more about the uncertainty that you invoke here and how uncertainty works. And what is your greatest hope for a university where we've got thousands on this campus, close to 40,000 students in a generation that is being educated and prepared to lead after we're gone?
Yeah.
What's the uncertainty that you're invoking here?
So I wonder whether we can bridge some of these chasms. I mean, you have to be able to talk to each other. You have to be able to trust. You have to feel like the ground you're standing on is stable. It's interesting. I used to lead students on these trips around the world, and one of the things that I would point out, and it's noticeable even right here, right, is that in this room, right, temperature's controlled, the lighting's controlled, there are windows keeping the sound out, insulation in. We trust that the electricity is going to work. We trust that nobody is going to come riotously breaking in and threatening our safety. Now, in that environment, you can have a conversation because you can let your guard down, because some of those fundamental Maslow's hierarchy of needs, some of those base survival things are taken care of, so you can start talking. But if you don't have that safety, and by the way, that's actually, I think it was illustrated yesterday, when you don't have that safety, when you don't have that sense that I feel comfortable and safe here, then what you're doing is you're basically, there's a sense of hypervigilance, and you have to question, is what I'm going to say be used against me? Is it going to be twisted into something else? Are people going to give me the generosity if I make a mistake, or are they going to tweet that to gazillions of people, and am I going to have to be worried for my family's safety at home? That's the uncertainty. And we have a choice. We all have a choice. We can sit on the sidelines and we can let that all happen. We can decide, no, actually, I'm going to police my own community, my own friends and family. I'm going to say this isn't okay. But sitting, Elie Wiesel said, there are people who are, you can be a victim, you can be a victimizer, or you can be a bystander. And I think, the bystanders fall under the category of victimizers, because whenever any minority population is under assault, you can sit on the sidelines, but you've got blood on your hands for it.
Right. I want to read a little further. You said, currently, we are not seeing each other as fellow citizens and community members working toward the common good together. I continually hear from people in our community about the worry and anxiety they feel. I feel it too. But what has been striking is that across this political spectrum, everyone wants to get off this path, but nobody seems to know how. Say more about that comment.
So I feel like what has happened is, and I know this is a problematic way of phrasing it, but you have a bell curve, and you have the tails of the bell curve. As long as the tails of the bell curve, which by their nature are going to be a more extreme perspective, as long as those folks are the ones dominating the conversation, and it doesn't matter where you are, I'm talking about like left, right, doesn't matter. But if you are if that's the place where the conversation is being controlled, then anybody who's in the center, which is the vast majority of society, by the way, they are silenced. But those are the people, that's the group where the dialogue can actually happen. Because the thing that I'm aware of, and again, I know this is not necessarily popular, but it's just true it's my truth, okay? But I don't think it's my truth, I think it's actually the truth, is that you have to be able to feel like that, I should phrase this differently. There are some people who you can't talk with because they're so marinated in their ideologies and their perspective that it's a fool's errand. And you have to recognize at some point, I'm not going to have a productive conversation with this person because they're not really interested in it. And I think as long as those are the people who are dominating the conversation and are allowed to dominate the conversation, then all the folks who actually really do want to try to learn and grow and expand and change their perspectives, then that never gets to happen.
So what do you do with those people that either aren't ready or aren't willing, but you're still in community? How do you think about what to do with those folks? Do you let them go? Do you wait for them?
Well,
What does someone committed to community do in cases where people just aren't ready to engage in conversation with one another?
I can tell you what I try to do, and it sometimes works, is I try to connect with people on their basic humanity and try to understand what's the underlying fear and what's behind the ideology, right? And that sometimes that works, and sometimes, again, it doesn't necessarily work. Like, I'm not trying to change anybody's mind. When I used to work at Hillel, my colleague and I used to always say, our goal isn't to change people's perspective, students' perspective. Our goal is that they will challenge their own perspective and at least tighten their argument. If some of them will change their perspective, but sometimes they'll just tighten their thinking so that it's not loose logic, fuzzy logic.
Yeah. I have a generational question to ask you, because I'm resonating with everything that you're saying.
Well, that's good.
Especially, and you and I have talked a great deal about the importance of seeing each other's humanity, of engaging in civil discourse, hearing one another with great depth. Some call it radical listening. And I was taught to believe that way. I was raised in a Catholic church, and there's a certain decorum.
I went to a Catholic college.
I
was the only Jewish kid there.
Right? Oh, interesting. John F. Kennedy was president for a period of time, and he was seen as a prince. He was flawed, but we didn't talk about those flaws. He was held up as iconic. Martin Luther King was held up as iconic, so we had respect for our leaders. We had respect for a nation. When I went to school, I think we did the Pledge of Allegiance. We put our hand on our head and said the Pledge of Allegiance. My father was in the Air Force. So it was in my blood to think the way that you're thinking right now. And I'm looking at a generation of young people that will have a ballot in front of them that has Donald Trump and Kamala Harris. And they're seeing TikTok videos. They're seeing snippets of conversation. They're seeing a kind of a discourse that looks very different than the discourse. And my hunch is, and you might know this better than I, I've seen some data, this is a generation that is less religious than the one before them. They go to church less. I don't know if they show up to synagogue more.
No, it's the same.
So there's a level of cynicism, in part because some people, and I'm going to own it in my generation, have modeled our humanity and have not modeled the kind of civil discourse that we're asking for young people. So they don't necessarily have the same image of authority and the institutions that they represent. Because churches, actually, they're human people behind the screen when you go to confession. University leaders are human beings. Presidents and Congress people are human beings. How do we regain the faith of a generation that's saying, how did civility work for all of you? Because what we've got right now is pretty broken, and your generation is part of that problem. Is there a generational gap that's happening for people for whom these institutions have not worked the same?
Trust and respect, learning community. Are we transparent and honest? I think that, one of the things I try to do at JFS, I try to be, and it doesn't always work. I can be as transparent as I possibly can be, but it doesn't always work. But I think being transparent and honest and not, my perspective on is that particularism and universalism. I want, and for my children, I'll speak from that side. I want my kids to be part. I want them to travel the world, and I want them to be part of society as a whole. That's really important to me. It's critically important to me. But I also want them to be understand their own particular unique history and their own particular story. And I think when you don't know your story, you get lost in time. because whatever comes your way, you can just go to the smorgasbord. But that's not really all that authentic. Now, this is the other thing, so I studied as a rabbi, so I believe deeply in lines of tradition. But the other thing that I love, like I'm super passionate about, is art and the line of tradition of classical art. And the reason why I'm really interested in it, and that's why I particularly love that piece of art, is the reason why I love the classical tradition is because it comes from a line of tradition. And that kind of art, in the same way as my rabbinic training, is slow thinking. It is slow process built over time and reflection and dialogue over time. It is not TikTok, it is not Instagram, it is not tweets or whatever X's, I don't even know what you call them anymore. It's or Snapchat, again, I don't know if that's still a thing, but it is deep, hard work of relationships. Somebody, and I don't remember who, said relationships are built at the speed of trust.
Yeah.
And I think that only happens over time. And that's what I don't think people understand. And that, to me, is where the deep wisdom comes from, those much deeper, more tectonic kind of human experiences over time. And that's where we need to focus. And that's above the local politics. That's above the latest kind of atrocity that happened in somebody's somebody's protest over this or that. It's something deeper and bigger, and that's where that's where I try to focus my energy.
Well, I'm sensitive with this question because I'm spending lots of time thinking about college campuses now. What's happening in those college campuses, the different ways in which the tensions around social justice and different perspectives around social justice, especially as it relates to the war in Gaza. And the multiple narratives that are rooted in forms of trauma. There's so much suffering that's going on right now. And close connection to that suffering. I've had students and families come to me and say, I know someone, there's close connectivity. You're hearing a lot from the Jewish community about our campus and about campuses. And I'm sensitive to even ask this question because I'm going to have to hear some truths. What are people saying about the experience of Jewish students on campus now? What are you hearing from the community? Because I think you're hearing from them a lot.
Yeah, I mean, this again, I think there's a sense of being erased. There's a sense that there is a hierarchy of minority communities, and the Jewish community is not even considered a minority community. We're just considered white, despite the fact, if you talk about Israel, half the country are people of color. If you talk about Jews in the United States, like if you talk to a Sephardic Jew from a Spanish-speaking or a Mizrahi, they don't think in terms of BIPOC. Like that's not a frame of reference. So you talk to someone that you would see, any young person would sort of say this is a person of color. But if you talk to them, and I'm talking about young people who are people of color, that's not the language that they were educated to think in terms. And so we apply onto people something that doesn't necessarily apply to them. I mean, I look white, and sure, I have privilege of white privilege, and that's all true. But I also recognize that I'm contingently white. I am white until dominant society says you're not. And what we're seeing right now is dominant society saying you're not. And that, to me, is what I don't think people really, truly want to understand. And so what you have is, in every other minority community, the minority community can determine what does it mean for them. But for Jews, they can't do that. And so what it creates is a sense of keep your head down, don't say anything. If you're religious and you wear a kippah, cover your head with a baseball hat. Try to be very careful of what you say. Don't. If you're willing to disavow Israel, or you're willing to say I'm not a Zionist, you're welcome in. But if you say, yeah, I do believe Israel has a right to exist as the homeland for the Jewish people, in the same way I believe the Palestinians have a right to the homeland for the Palestinian people. If you say that, we've seen that in different parts of our own community. Zionism has no place here. If you're Zionists, as I also wrote in that same thing, Zionist has become an acceptable slur. And like, what world is that acceptable?
For our students, define what you mean by Zionism.
To me, again, and that's also part of.
Right.
This is super interesting what you just said. So one, I have stopped using the term social justice because it is a lightning rod term and it means such different things for different people. So to me, one of the key things we have to do is define our terms.
Yeah.
Because of the fuzzy logic is we throw words around, but we're not doing the intellectual rigor to actually define what are you actually talking about.
Yeah.
And so that's true for social justice. It's true for Zionists. So for me, when I say I'm a Zionist, which I am, I believe Israel has a right to exist as the homeland for the Jewish people on its ancestral homeland. That does not mean I don't believe the Palestinians also have a right to a peaceful homeland for them to live out on their ancestral homes. I think that's also true. But that it's not, half of the Jewish population on our planet lives in what is called the State of Israel. Half of all Jews. So when people say from the river to the sea, and they mean expulsion of the Jews from the land of Israel, what they are saying is and we've seen that narrative before. I know that story. That is what my rabbinic training was all about. That's what I don't think people understand. So would you say that to somebody? And can you really believe that? And that to me is what's so painful for a lot of young Jewish students, because they don't have they don't have a deep understanding of history. They don't have a deep understanding of. They're coming to school to learn. They're coming to school to be curious and students and to go to football games. And the next thing they know, they're having to run a gauntlet. And then they're forced into this, are you with us, against us? Do I want to, and they're seeing this happen for my own kids. It's like your friends who you thought you really, they have no care about how you're experiencing these things. And that's really quite profoundly painful for anybody.
So you're holding these concerns, complaints, critiques. Describe some of them for me. What are you hearing from families and community?
In the community?
Yeah.
It's not safe to be Jewish on campus. You have to hide your Judaism. The university isn't, they're picking and choosing what communities they're willing to protect and stand up for. They're allowing professors to say things which are making it impossible for students to complain, because if they complain, the power dynamic is so set up against the student that they're afraid to make a complaint. You can look at the graffiti that was all over this campus last year. I personally have, I see that. It's like a sense of harassment, a sense of intimidation, a sense of like, you're not really wanted here, or you don't belong here, that's allowed to fester, a sense that if this were any other minority community, this would never be tolerated. Again, now whether or not it's true or not, whole different conversation. And you asked me what I'm hearing, so those are the things I'm hearing.
I'm also hearing, and there's a subtlety to this comment, because of who I am in relation to you. We were with you, we Jews were with you in the 1960s. Before that, we were with you in 2020. And from October 7th on, you were not with us. We felt isolated. It's not named, but I think that's a comment about a racial distinction.
100%. So that's a whole different side. Yes, and I'm hearing that. I mean, that's my own experience. That's not what I'm hearing. That's like my own experience. Is like, and I don't think it is a good idea to sort of put capital in the social justice bank account or the emotional relational bank account, because I'm like, essentially I'm investing in this so that I can pull it out later. I don't buy that way of being. I think you do things because it's the morally correct thing to do. And I think what's hard and painful is when people you've thought as your friends aren't there for you, and are not only not there for you, but they're lining up against you. And there's not the curiosity, there's not an openness, there's not an understanding of how are you experiencing this? This must be really hard. There's not a curiosity about, what do you think of what the Israeli government is doing? Like, nobody asks those questions. There's not a possibility, and I tend to believe we don't do a good job of teaching young people how to live in the gray. How do you deal with a world which is not clean? In my view, everybody has blood on their hands. You can look at this country and the things that we do, which allow us to live in this comfortable, calm spot. It just happens off camera, and people aren't protesting that. They're not protesting so much of what happens in our society, or our country, or our world. Yeah. And I think that's what is confusing.
Yeah. And yet there's this iconic image of Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel side by side with Martin Luther King in 1965. Have you seen that image?
Oh, God, yeah.
And what does it symbolize for you?
So the story, I mean, the thing that's really interesting about the story is Abraham Joshua Heschel was raised to be a Hasidic Rebbe. He was part of a dynasty. He wasn't just some secular German Jew. He was raised in an ultra religious Hasidic community. And what he did, and this is that particularism universal thing I was describing, what he did is he was able to transcend, he had a thick Yiddish accent as well, he was able to transcend that, to understand something greater, but he never sacrificed his core identity. And Martin Luther King didn't either. Like, again, to be able to walk side by side with somebody, but not having to sacrifice your identity and your story. And you know, it says that which is hateful to you, do not do unto others. That's what people love. That's the quote people love. Hillel is the rabbi 2,000 years ago said that. But the last part of that quote, the part that nobody pays attention to, the rest is commentary, go and learn. Mm-hmm. So if you do the first part, that's the golden rule, that's lovely. But if you don't pay attention to the last part, the rest is commentary, go and learn, then you actually miss the whole point of the quote.
Let's invoke our students to go and learn, well, because we can sit in the problem, we can sit in the division, but you're someone I look to be in conversation around what do we do? How do we see this as a long journey? How do we see beyond the moment in time? And what are some things that, because you and I are in conversation around what we can do now, and you're sitting here in part because you haven't given up, right? And nor have I. So what are some practical things that we can ask our students to do, our university to do, and our community to do to begin to bridge? We may not get those people who have lost faith. There are people who have given up. But for those of us that are still operating in the center, what are some things that we need to be doing?
Serious, heart-to-heart, authentic conversation, and learning how to have hard conversations built over time, investing over and over and over again in those kind of dialogues, and use text as a place. You know, I use text all the time because what it does is it brings the ancestors into the room, but they're just a voice around the table. They're not the authoritative voice necessarily. But what it does is it allows me to have a conversation with you and get to know you better. The idea of a chavruta, it's a Jewish concept, is it comes from this word haver, which is friend, mm-hmm. right? And the idea, and again, this is an ancient text, make for yourself a teacher, acquire for yourself a friend, right? Like, by studying together, in dialogue, something greater happens. Because you can, and it doesn't mean that you don't throw away your views, and it means you debate. You have hard conversations, but you're doing, and this is actually really important. You're doing it l'shem shamayim. You're doing it for the sake of heaven. I'm not trying to, you know it. Whenever you argue with somebody or debate someone, you can tell if that person is debating out of a sense of ego, or out of a sense of really trying to understand the truth and coming at it from a point of authenticity, which, by the way, is why I think it's so important for students to get off the college campus and into the world, like really into the world. Mm-hmm. And that to me is where, because it changes how you understand yourself, it changes how you understand your own society, and that to me is so critical.
You started with text, Will, and I think you're absolutely right, because I've found that if we just start with dialogue, and especially with young people, and your person, your whiteness is the text, the conversation tends not to go very far, or if my blackness is the text. So in conversations around race in America, around policing, They end up being shallow kinds of conversation if you don't understand the history of policing and the relationship between policing and the black community and its roots that go back to forms of enslavement. We end up in conversations, well, my uncle is a police officer and he's a good guy, so what's the problem with policing? But it's not an informed conversation. With respect to Gaza and Israel, it is a multidimensional conversation that requires not just opinion right away. It requires some understanding of a historical context. In which historic context do you start?
Exactly.
A contemporary understanding of how things are now in some depth. And also another dimension of what we imagine to be a future state. And I'd want students to have information before coming right into. So text seems important in this conversation, and not necessarily the human being the text, or a placard or a TikTok video being the text, because there is destruction all over the place. So images of children dying are on all sides. Blood is on all of our hands. So how do we get to the place of text? And even you're an artist also, Will. One of the things I appreciate you, because art can be text as well. Mm-hmm. So how do we begin, and how does text help inform us and engage us in a conversation? In what
so there are people that I study with who politically I totally disagree with. Mm-hmm. But they're some of my closest friends now. And our views are not the same. And I don't expect them to be the same. But I love these people. And I think that what it does is I don't even know how it works, because I don't understand the psychology of what happens, but there's something about trying to unpack something really complicated and then engaging in what does this mean? What does this mean for society? What does this mean about me as a human? How do I take this into the world? What do I do with this? And then having that creative, joyful debate, which is not about the latest political horror, right? It's about like some ancient thing that they were struggling with 1,000, 2,000 years ago. And it's like, what does it tell us about our humanity? I mean, like, to me, that's incredible. And I think you made this comment, I think it's super interesting. How horrible would it be if I defined you fully and totally by the color of your skin? And I said, this is, oh, you're a black man, therefore I know I can, da-da-da. It's like, there's so much that I would have no concept of what you really think about. And I think it's ironic because it is so superficial. It's like the only way you understand somebody is by really letting them tell their story. And I think the way you learn to tell somebody's story is really, again, that's the beauty of study, poetry, art, music, but like not to, this is just going to prove the point that I want to make. I mean, when I studied in England as a kid, one of the things that was amazing is I remember taking a class on Plato's Republic, and the way they taught the class was super interesting. It was like, here's the text of Plato's Republic, here's two totally different views on the same text. Read these two different views, debate those views, think about those views, write about those views, but it wasn't spoon feeding you, and this is the truth. It wasn't about indoctrinating people. And I think one of the things that has gone really astray on college campuses and in society as a whole, frankly, in our whole education system, is we don't actually teach young people how to engage with oppositional thinking and look at that as just as potentially legitimate. And I'm not talking about the debates. I'm not talking about that kind of stuff. I'm talking about like people who are sincere, thoughtful thinkers who've just landed on a different place on a topic. And then exploring, well, how did they come to that view? Where does that come from? And that to me that's the beauty of talking to someone who I really don't agree with. I get to sit and say, well, what was your lived experience that got you to that conclusion? And then if it's not coming from a place of attack or I'm trying to change your mind, but it's just coming from a place of trying to understand, you really can find an opening to a heart-level conversation as opposed to a brain-level conversation, which, by the way, I understand that's sort of not what universities are about. But I think we can talk from our head or we can talk from our heart. And I think that there's a real difference in a conversation from the heart, even over a text, by the way, versus a conversation from the head.
Yeah. I heard a rabbi say, when he was speaking to Jews, and the reason I found this resonant because it applies to other populations and my own people as well. He said, oftentimes we, Jews, don't listen, we wait. We wait for you to speak. And we come back with a retort and really sort of blow you up. And I found myself thinking about that, the difference between listening and waiting. I'm going to read another piece from you, Will. If we can learn to approach each other with more curiosity and less certainty, it will be possible to expand the circle of compromise and find the areas of mutual concern we need to do more to challenge our assumptions and broaden our own perspectives. We need to be willing to change our opinions. There's a lot that you said there, and there's some optimism in this. Approaching each other with curiosity and less certainty, and a willingness to change our opinions. Curiosity is important to you, and less certainty. Talk about the importance of curiosity as a methodology.
Yeah, it's interesting. So what popped in my mind, so in English we say pay attention. Mm-hmm. In Hebrew we say sim lev, which is to place your heart.
Say it again.
Sim, place, lev, heart. To place your heart. So if I'm saying I'm paying attention to you, I'm paying something. If I'm placing my heart with you, I'm coming from a totally different point of reference in terms of how I'm engaging in a dialogue. And I love the exploration. I love curiosity. To me, I mean, you go back to like you're white and you're Jewish, right? Oh, so what are the assumptions people have about me? Would they know that I was raised in a very blue-collar family and I had railroad tracks in the backyard? Nope, wouldn't bet that. Would they know that I had to pay my way through college and nobody told me to go through college? Probably, I guess, I would bet most people would not know that. Would they know that I had to start at a community college because I wasn't going to go to college, I was selling shoes? Probably would not know that either. Because the assumptions people walk into the conversation with, unconscious or conscious, are just, that is the frame by which they begin to assess who I am and what I think. But if you start saying like, oh wait, you had railroad tracks in the backyard of your house and your house rumbled when the train went by? Oh, that's weird. That's not what I think of Jews as being. Oh, you had to pay your way through college? You went to a Catholic college? You know, like nothing fits the quote narrative that you want. But all people are that way. Very few people fit the narrative that we have for them. And when we are willing to share of that narrative, and I'll tell you, this is it was something that up until maybe 10, 15 years ago, I was embarrassed by my upbringing. Like I never would talk about it. And I was ashamed by it, and I thought I was a fraud, and I thought and I still think, how did I end up here? Like there's nothing about my upbringing at all, which should have me sitting across from you having this conversation. Nothing. But for whatever quirk in the cosmos, here we are. But what pains me is when people project assumptions on what I believe about things without giving me the opportunity to share what I think about something. And I think that that's the curiosity part, because what I have found over and over and over again is people surprise you. And it may be more complicated and nuanced. Because again, it's not about whatever the topic is that you're arguing about, it's about who are you as a person. It's almost like, and I know this isn't, I don't mean it this way, but the person becomes the text in a certain way. And the same way I was taught to understand how to read text is the way I think about relationships. So I start with, like, the first time I'll read anything is, what does it say? Yeah. You know, like, you tell me your story.
Yeah. Can you think of a time when you have changed your position or changed your mind on something of significance? Because you're inviting it here. Can you think of a time when you've done that?
So a few things. One, everything. Like, I more or less constantly change we evolve. Yeah. We change. So, you know, that's like, there are so many things. I'm thinking of, like, I have a bunch of very specific things, but I'm not sure that they're all that useful for what we're talking about. You know, as it relates to Israel, I'll tell you, when I was a college student, I was in Berlin when the wall came down, and then I went into the Middle East before the first Gulf War, which was like back when it was a long time ago. But I remember being in Jordan, and I remember listening, and the Jordanian people were phenomenally amazing people. And I remember the Jordanian English news was on, and there was talk about a Palestinian fishing boat that had been blown up off the coast of Tel Aviv by the Israeli army, and it was horrifying, and it was appalling. I'd never actually ever been to Israel before, so I went from Egypt to Jordan and then into Israel. And the next day, literally the next day, I crossed Israel. The same story was on the English Israeli news, but the story was totally different. It was a group of Palestinian terrorists that were about to attack a beach in Tel Aviv, and they were stopped by the Israeli army. And I thought, even I was 21 years old, I was a totally naive kid, but I thought that is an illustration of exactly the problem. Yeah. Something happened. We don't actually know what happened, but the narratives are so polar opposite that you can completely understand how those societies would move to complete demonizing of the other. And I think that the understanding is that most of the things that we think of as like simple truths are not simple truths. We are being taught over and over that the narrative that we are being fed is trying to indoctrinate us into a position. Our job is to constantly question that narrative and find out, is this really true? And is this authentic for who I am? And am I willing to really change? So when you ask, how are there things, I really do say, I mean, I'm constantly evolving. Some ideas haven't changed at all. I mean, something like the day before I picked up a pencil 10 years ago, I would have said, I suck at art, I can't do art, I don't like art, it's not my thing. 10 years later, it's like, I am profoundly passionate about it. If you had said to me, I would have said, I'm a terrible student, I can't do anything, I'm dumb, dyslexic and dysgraphic as well to top it off. And so that was my identity. I didn't know that I just didn't know that about me, that there could be a possibility. And I think we don't get, all right, I'm sorry, maybe I'm now getting to the answer to your question. What I think is the biggest change, where I've really changed my opinion, is about myself. Because I think we know, you and I we were talking about generational, we think we know ourselves. We have no idea what's possible for us. And what happens is we at our generation, we sort of lock ourselves in as well. And the interesting thing that happened, and I use that art piece as the example because it's what happened to me. It was like I thought I expect my wife to surprise me. I always expect my kids to surprise me. But when you get to be my age, I don't expect myself to surprise me. I feel like I'm kind of baked. And then all of a sudden, out of nowhere, you start to discover that who you think you are is not necessarily who you are. You could be something totally different, and it deepens your soul, your humanity, and that's beautiful. And I think that doesn't matter if you are a 10-year-old, if you are a 20-year-old, if you're a 70-year-old. The coolest thing in the world is when somebody realizes that they're capable and there's so much more to them than who they think they are. And that's the gift of our humanity again.
This is all very humble work, isn't it, Will? And I didn't prepare you to talk about traditions, but a little more than a year ago, I was invited to participate in Yom Kippur. And I did a little bit of learning, just a little bit at the surface to understand what I was being invited to. And I was invited into a community. I was invited into a concept that essentially said that we can begin again. We can atone and we can begin again. And some of the tenets reminded me of how I was raised, both in the Black community, but also in the Catholic community. There were themes that were actually familiar. I asked my friends and colleagues what you wear on Yom Kippur, and I was told that many will be wearing white, and I asked why. You're nodding because these are all things that you know that I did not know. So I chose to wear white. And the power of the concept of realizing that we're preparing for our death is so Socratic and so powerful. And I found myself resonating, not in a political moment, but with traditions that invite us to actually think about how short our time here is on this earth, how little time we have to be in battle with each other, and that we can actually be literal in saying, I forgive you. Have I done harm? And I started thinking about the concept of begin again and thinking about what it means to be in a university, that we begin again. We start again. We start with a convocation, we begin again. And I thought about these traditions that help us begin. Talk about some of the traditions that that you would invite people like me to understand and be a part of, because I just found it so powerful and transformative.
Gosh, it's beautiful you pointed that out, actually. So one, we're in the month of Elul right now, and the month of Elul is what precedes the high holidays. This is the time when we ask for forgiveness. When we do what's called a cheshbon nefesh, when we reflect an accounting of the soul, when we reflect on our year, and then we go and find the people that we messed up with. We don't just say, oh, I'm sorry. You say, I did this thing, it was wrong, I am sorry, and I won't do that again. And then when given the opportunity to do the thing again, you don't do it. It's not enough to just say, I'm sorry. What's amazing about that dressed in white, and I've thought about this a little bit with some of these protests and some of the other things, is when you're dressed in white, you're actually essentially, you ascend to heaven mystically, and you are looking back on your life. And it's like, imagine, and again, I won't go down this road too far, but imagine if you could play a recording of your past year, and you just got to watch how did you respond in each of these situations. So I remember, and I wrote about this once, that when my kid was really little, I remember him repeating something that I said, and I was like, oh my gosh, I can't believe he was playing back the recording, and I realized that's not who I want to be, and it's not who I want him to think. I don't want him to see me as that person, and it's a corrective. It's a way to look back and say, like, if you saw the hatred in your eyes when you were protesting or in the worst fight with somebody who's you were supposed to love, and you could see what you looked like and how your face looked, you know, and then you asked yourself, is that who you want to be? Is that who you want to be remembered as? My guess is you don't. Even if it's a just cause, that is not who you want to be. So that to me is very beautiful. The other thing that's very beautiful, two pieces I'd say about that holiday season, is you may remember people sort of hit their chest, right? Yes. So one year when I used to lead services at Hillel, I gave everybody there a stone to put in their hand, because we are good at beating our chests. We're good at that part. But the other part of that is the letting go, which is the release, having I made a mistake, and then the forgiveness, which is an internal self-forgiveness. But you don't feel the release, you feel the weight of hitting your chest. But I wanted people to feel the release of I atone, I made a mistake, I'm now I'm purer, I'm letting myself go. And I think that that's important. And I think that, and the other piece, which is beautiful about that service, and I should stop because you've got me rabbiing now, is that you're not just asking for forgiveness for the things you did wrong. You're asking forgiveness for everybody else in the room with you. Like, it's all of that. And my dad, who again was a electrician, used to say when we would drive away from synagogue, I remember it really clearly as a kid, we can't even get out of the parking lot, and we used to drive to synagogue, we can't even get out of the parking lot before people are honking and swearing at each other. Like, did they not pay attention at all to what we were just talking about? And again, it doesn't matter if you say the words if it doesn't sort of sink into your heart. Yeah. Yeah. And so that to me is where the opportunity exists in those services. But those are just things that just sit there, but they don't mean anything if you don't really take it seriously.
My mother played the piano in a Catholic church, and then eventually started playing gospel music. And gospel music is interesting because it can follow and go to a low note, but it always ends on a high. It takes you into the dark, into the depths, and eventually takes you up to hope. Well, as you're talking about these concepts of begin again and letting go, in reality, you and I are facing communities that are divided right now, and especially on college campuses. And there was harm on campuses around the country, and there's harm in the Jewish community that we're dealing with now. Do you think at individual levels Yom Kippur makes sense? Does it make sense at institutional levels as well? Do you think that there is repair and healing that can be done in communities that are quite divided right now and angry with each other?
100%. 100%. Is it done authentically? Is it done with humility? Is it done with a recognition? Is it, because when somebody is, not always, but when someone's playing you, versus like, is this a sincere person who's really asking for forgiveness? And did they do the kind of reflection? And I think if that's done, and there's an ownership, a real ownership, we screwed up, we want to do better, help us do better. I mean, I just got in front of my entire staff last week at JFS and apologized and said, I am positive I have screwed up. And I pointed out a couple places where I did. And I'm like, I'm sorry. Imagine how powerful, it is an incredibly powerful thing to take the month of Elul seriously and to really go around, and because you feel so much lighter and freer, because nobody wants everybody knows the sense of like you're walking down campus and you run across the person, someone you just broke up with, somebody you had a fight with, somebody who's a colleague you don't like, whatever, and it's not enjoyable to see that person and feel like embarrassed or I've got to turn the other way. You want to, I want to see that person and I want to say, it's so good to see you, how are you? And like know that I've cleaned up my accounts. And that I am in a better place with that relationship. Heschel, Abraham Joshua Heschel, the rabbi you referenced, he said once, sin is any disruption in a relationship between humans and God. That was a Heschel quote. I changed that a little bit because I think sin is any disruption in a relationship between a person and another person. And sin, by the way, in Hebrew, in the Jewish concept, is a concept of like missing the mark. It's like you didn't land where you wanted to land. It's like an archer's term. But like the ability to remove the static and disruption in our relationships, that's how you come to a place of redemption. The other thing, another Hebrew word that I love, by the way, in the same concept, the same idea, we talk in the United States, in America, in English, I should say, about sacrifice. What are you willing to sacrifice? In Hebrew, the word isn't sacrificed, it's korban, and it comes from a word which means to draw close, karov. So like, I'm not sacrificing for you, I'm doing something which draws me closer to you. And it is so much more powerful when we think of it in terms of like, I'm not giving something up, I'm doing something to draw closer. I want to understand your pain, and I want to figure out how do we help each other? And that to me that's what's the beautiful part of what could be.
You're giving us hope here. Well, the final question. I spent some time this summer thinking about how to talk to students about the kinds of things that can go wrong and the kinds of harms that are in our midst. How to talk about being anti-racist, how to talk about being equitable, justice. We've even introduced language of anti-Semitism, Islamophobia into conversations. And that's a lot to ask students that are just trying to get here and find their classes and figure out their roommate and whether the food is good or not, and they're thinking differently. They will get to that conversation in time, but to start with, here's anti-Semitism, I want you to understand this, is a bit much to start with, but we have to do some learning here. So we want to begin a conversation about what constitutes belonging on campus, where every student who comes here, whether they come here or not, by virtue of being in this place, that you belong. That's different than inclusion. We've got a set of rules and you need to be included in it. You need to fit our culture. What does belonging, what are habits of belonging, what are institutions and communities that foster belonging? What do they look like? And for our students, what's your hope for them, for all of our students, in a framework of belonging?
So what I popped into my mind is the same thing I said before about you have to have, the temperature's right, like a safe place.
Right.
What are the policies? I mean, what are the policies? If you say that this is the rule or this is the way it's going to be, do they have teeth? Do you actually enforce those things, or are they just words? Because the other thing, and I remember, do you know, how long have you been at UW now?
It's been over 25 years.
All right. Can you remember when you started and they gave you your little training about the rules and policies?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. How much of it do you remember, though? None of it. And that's what I would say. You can't say it once.
No.
It is how do you live it on a daily basis? How do you bring it up and talk about it? How do you remind people about it? How do you evaluate people about that? And if belonging, which is, JF, one of our values, is how do we actually create a culture of belonging? You have to look at the policies, and then are we living by those policies? And are we are we constantly reminding people? So, I was just doing an evaluation for someone, I was writing it up, and one of our core values is trust and respect, and the other is a learning community. There's one of a bunch of them. But when we're doing evaluations, we ask people, does your supervisor model our agency core values? Do they live them out? Because if you just talk about them on day one, or if you just put them on a wall, it's nothing. It's like the thing is about the text, by the way, back to our other conversation. It's how do you make those things, those words live and breathe? How do you take these old ideas and make them new and relevant and compelling in how we live our lives? And that's true for talking about anti-Semitism. I mean, to some kid from, somewhere out not run across many Jews, doesn't know from anti-Semitism or Islamophobia, they're drinking from a fire hose. Talk about giving somebody some grace. You can't, but it can't be a one and done. It's the continuation over time of a perpetual conversation of living out the core values you're trying to see enacted on this campus and by extension our society.
Rabbi Will Berkovitz, thank you for showing up today. Thank you for being rabbinic at times. And thank you for trusting enough to know that we will begin again. And thank you for being on the journey with us.
Thank you very much for inviting me. And I hope it is meaningful and helpful.
It's deeply so.